Hello, my History 289 students. This is Professor Donald Earl Collins talking to you about Week 5 and what to do, what to talk, or what your readings are about, and your How History is Created paper. And I'll try to cover both of those as briefly, but as concisely and cogently as I can today. I don't want this to be too long a video, since we're now dealing with stuff that we should, that's building on the things that you've learned in the first half of the course now that we're in the second half. So, the main themes in the readings this week involve really three things. Search for truth. In other words, what is truth? Even from a philosophical standpoint with regard to history. Revisionist history, how history gets revised, and so on and so forth, which deals ultimately with the issue of historiography. And then finally, the issue of gender studies in the readings around that. Talk to you briefly about your grades and, so far in the course, and talk to you about the paper coming up. So let's start with the readings. The readings really can be broken down into three parts. One part deals with the issue of truth. Essentially, there's a couple of authors who deal with this indirectly, and they're asking the question, well, what is truth? Is there such a thing as absolute truth? Now, there's a whole set of philosophical discussions revolving around epistemological discussions, actually, around the issue of what, essentially what President Clinton was talking about during the Monica Lewinsky scandal. Well, really, his scandal of sexually harassing a woman and causing a relationship to happen with that woman scandal, because it's not her scandal, it's his scandal, after all. He asked a question during his deposition of what is, right? What is, right? So in this case, what is truth? I mean, even the things that we know to be historical facts don't necessarily add up in terms of absolute truth, because it depends on what angle you're looking at it from, what lens or aperture you tend to use in looking at an event. You can look at the Declaration of Independence, for instance, from two standpoints. You can look at it from the standpoint of the people who wrote it and people who revised it. The 55 people who signed off on the Declaration, mostly, all white men, mostly landowning white males, mostly white males who happen to have a lot of money. Most of them at least nominally heterosexual and nominally Protestant Christians, right? There might have been some among them who were Catholic. There might have been some of them who were in the closet. We don't know all those details, even as much as people have studied the Founding Fathers, right? But the bottom line is, their lens for looking at the Declaration of Independence and their truth around it is different than if you look at it from, say, the standpoint of African American history, or the standpoint of women's history, or the standpoint of Native American history. So even something as factually true as the signing of the Declaration of Independence and the reading it out loud at Independence Hall in Philadelphia on July the 2nd of 1776 gets twisted up around the issue of truth. So that's one thing. Then there's revisionist history, which is even a wider lens, more panoramic, to look at the issue not only of truth, but the issue of what is history, and how do we define history, and how historiography changes over time, right? Our understanding of different points of history has changed. Some authors and many people in the historical profession, if not most, realize that history is a constantly evolving field, and our understanding of events, of patterns, of processes that have taken place throughout history change over time. What we consider the truth, or the most accurate version of the truth that we have on a particular event now, might change. It might not. It depends. We understand more and more about the Roman Empire, for instance, because people have kept looking at it and looking at it and looking at it, and realizing that the Roman Empire, while there's this sense of lament among many European historians about the end of the Roman Empire in the 5th century CE or AD, depending on whether you use Anno Anno Domino, or after the birth of Christ, or the Common Era, which is CE, by the way. But depending on how you look at it, from a European historian standpoint, they lament the end of the Roman Empire because it ends in the midst of deep seed, deep well of corruption. It ends bankrupt, and it ends basically under the constant invasion of barbarians. But in revising that history, we understand that most of these so-called barbarians weren't. They were highly civilized people who had built their own cities and own regions in Northern Europe and Central Europe, but they were pushed westward by the encroachment of the Huns and other groups from the steppes of Central Asia. So these are really migrations and huge swaths of people, millions of people migrating into what would have been the Roman Empire, the Western and Central Roman Empire at the time. It's a huge migration force that the Romans are ill prepared to deal with. And along with that migration comes armies, comes people who don't like the oppressiveness of the Roman Empire, and they rise up against the Roman Empire and eventually sack Rome as a result of it. So, depending on how you look at it, Rome's either this really great empire with really wonderful architecture and language and laws and so on, or is this a really oppressive system of regime that is increasingly xenophobic, increasingly anti anything that's not considered Roman, et cetera, very ethnocentric, not necessarily racist in any modern sense, because it's not based on skin color, but it's based on whether you are, adhere to Roman norms or not. Certainly anti-pagan by the time you get to the 5th century, as Christianity has become the religion of the Roman Empire. So that's a revision. And all history, upon the pressures of further examination by more and more highly skilled people who are more willing to integrate the techniques of other fields and their analysis, means more revision. However, there are all these folks, particularly in the American context, who use the term revisionist history like it's a dirty word. How dare you revise anything? The history that I knew when I was growing up, when I went to high school, it should be the same as it is now, but it's not. That's revisionist history. You're practicing PC history. You're practicing PC history. That's the other thing that people say with regard to revisionist history or revising history. How dare you do it? Well, guess what? That's part of the profession. If you can't learn about about the fact that sometimes just because you have a fact of something happening on such and such a date at such and such time doesn't mean we understand how and why it happened. When you try to understand why humans do what they do and how they end up doing what they do, and the different groups of people that are involved in the process of how and why something happened, whether that something is a singular event or it's a pattern of events that lead to some grand change in your society, it means that you're going to invariably end up revising and tweaking your argument somewhat. Sometimes major revisions, sometimes minor revisions, sometimes a little iota of a revision, but it's still revision. And by the way, even the history that we thought we knew when we were in school 30 years ago, for some of you who are actually older than me, 50 years ago, for your parents and my parents, maybe even 70 or 80 years ago, that kind of history, as we talked about last week, is more than likely the kind of history that left people out. Because most history is, if history is written by the victors, or the more broadly speaking, the people who have power, right? Like people who wrote consensus history in the first half of the 20th century, like the people who were writing these grand magnum opus or opuses around the rise and fall of the Roman Empire, the greatness of the British Empire. America's great, America's wonderful, never does anything wrong kind of history. That leaves a lot out, leaves a lot of people out, leaves a lot of events out, leaves a lot of good, bad, and ugly truths out. And so these revisions really are taking place because people decided not to have a broad enough vision to begin with, right? So, part of the reaction to revisionist history is just people just poo-pooing on the idea that things like history can be revised. Like, just because you have the fact of something doesn't mean you understand the how and why behind it. There is such a thing as revising math, right? There's theoretical mathematics, where in point of fact 2 plus 2 might not even equal 4 in that form of mathematics, right? That's what if you do master's level work and PhD level work in mathematics, you're going to deal with all kinds of stuff where what you think is factual is just the tip of the iceberg. You don't really understand anything beyond the tip of the iceberg with those basic facts. Remember when I said in the first week that people are memorizing dates and names and events who consider themselves quote unquote history buffs? I know history because I memorize a whole bunch of stuff. That's not history, that's trivia. And those people who make the argument about revisionist history are very uncomfortable with the idea of learning more than what they've learned to win a game of Jeopardy or Trivial Pursuit. So there you go. The third thing, the third readings are around gender studies. Well, most people hear the term gender studies, they hear women's studies, right? You say gender, they say women. They say gender, you say women. Well, guess what? Last I checked, men have a gender too. And Jeffrey Glasgow, who's a colleague of mine at UMUC, one of his articles is in your readings for week 4, dealing with the issue of men's studies, of understanding how gender impacts men, right, from the standpoint of patriarchy and basically our patriarchal relationships with the world. And the point of the fact that patriarchy, which is in many cases helped protect whole groups of people over time, in the modern sense, is also bad, as generally speaking a dirty word, and a word that means really oppression, for a lot of other people, right? But even that understanding, men's studies, men having gender, is limited because there's all the groups of people known as transgender, right? People who might have the anatomical parts of a man or a woman, but really see themselves, for whatever reason, as female when they have male parts, or male when they have female parts, right? And that's all transgender is that the idea that you, on a fundamental level, identify as something that is not what you are reflected as anatomically speaking. Now, there's certainly evidence for it, scientific evidence for this as well, in terms of genetics, in terms of how your body functions hormonally, and so on and so forth. So it's not just in someone's head, as a lot of people might argue. But either way, the point of gender studies is to understand the nature of not only why not just feminism, but masculinity. When masculinity can be malignant, can be hyper, can be the kind of thing that allows for things like misogyny, allows for sexism, allows for dominance of other groups, kinds of things. And so Jeffrey Glasgow's exploring some of this in his writings. It's not the only article he's written on the topic, and it's actually his niche. So good for him. So you're getting a little taste of gender studies from this. So okay, as for your grades, guys did pretty well as a whole. I mean, lots of you got A's, some of you got B's. Those of you who got less than an 80 or 79 or 78, really you had two issues. Number one, there were a couple of places where you literally chose two different categories for some of your sources and categorizing sources assignment, where it really was only one, right? You you can't say that Paul McCartney is a primary and a secondary source during an interview, because he's a Beatle. He's the Beatle. Him and Lennon wrote most of the songs, right? So if he's not a primary source, whether he gives an interview 30 years, 50 years, 100 years after 1958 to 1964, then no one's a primary source. Nothing's a primary source with the Beatles then. So yes, he's a primary source. He can't be primary and secondary. And when the Trump says a historian writes an article, writes a book, even if you don't know all the other details, we are studying how historians do their work. And since historians, by and large, use primary and secondary sources to write their articles and write their books and do interpretation in the process of doing those things, then these sources are going to be secondary sources. They're not going to be tertiary. They're not going to be primary, and they're not going to be tertiary. They're secondary. Some things are definitive, right? If George Harrison writes an autobiography, by definition, it's a primary source. He lived it. It's his autobiography. Now, that doesn't mean it's a reliable source, okay? There's a difference. Primary source, all it means is that this is as close as you're going to get to the actual event or the people involved, because this is a first-hand account. That's all it means. Now, is it reliable and valid in the sense that everything he says is accurate? Is he doing a tell-all? He's telling things that can't be corroborated? Maybe. But that's a different issue. That's not the same issue as whether he's a primary source or not. And I think people were conflating primary source with the most valid possible source. It's also why a fan page can only be a tertiary source, even if the fan page has paraphernalia on it, or if it has, or if fans are debating over which is the best Beatles album from the 1958 to 1964 period. Because ultimately, it's created by fans. It's not created by a historian who might be an expert on the Beatles' discography, right? A music historian. So that's not a person. These aren't people that you can rely on. So it can't be a secondary source, and it can't be a primary source because they're fans, right? Even if the fan met Paul McCartney, even if the fan had some sort of friendship or relationship with Paul McCartney, they're still not a primary source. Are you a Beatle? No, so they're not a primary source either. I identified source 2 and source 5 as the two places where you could have gone either way, even with the assignment prompt written the way it was for source 5. Wikipedia entries, generally speaking, are tertiary sources, just like World Book Encyclopedia would be. Sometimes within those sources you have interpretations, and so that might raise it to the level of a secondary source, right? It might, but more than likely not. And so it's really caught between being a secondary and tertiary source in this particular case, right? Usually it's a tertiary source though. And the same thing with the CD question, because even though the chording might be original, the material that it's put on kind of makes it a secondary source, right? So depending on how you look at it, if you look at this, as I wrote down in, on all of your comments for all of your assignments, if you are studying the actual concert itself, technically speaking, of course it's a primary source because it's just a copy. But you have to keep in mind that it's a CD, and that means you've digitized the original copy. It means it went through a filtering process of some sort. And so for a music historian, it might not be a primary source. It might be a secondary source. And that's what I noted there. Hopefully no one has any other questions around this, because it's worth 5% of your grade. It's worth something, but it's not worth arguing about in that sense. You're not going to have too many cases where you're going to end up with something that fits multiple categories like that. It should be a little bit, hopefully, clear and obvious in that sense. And then finally,